The sun rises over the ancient city of Samarkand, and you find yourself standing amid a maze of turquoise domes and intricate tilework, where every mosaic seems to hum stories of centuries past. You breathe in air that smells faintly of baked bread and dusty stone, while merchants arrange vibrant fabrics under the early light, just as their ancestors did when caravans from China, Persia, and India once converged here. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family, scattered but still connected. All right, let's ease into the story together. As you walk along the same dusty roads that camels once padded across, the distant echoes of the Silk Road surround you, a reminder that Uzbekistan's roots were entwined with global currents long before modern borders were drawn. You trace your fingers along the walls of Bukhara's old madrasas, imagining the scholars who debated astronomy, medicine, and philosophy under candlelight, their words traveling farther than the caravans themselves. The region, with its fertile oases like the Fergana Valley and its strategic position between great empires, was never just a quiet backwater. It pulsed with exchange of goods, ideas, and power struggles. Historians still argue whether this cultural richness made it more resilient to later foreign domination or simply more attractive to invaders who wanted to control such a prize. In the early centuries, powerful dynasties like the Samanids and later the Timurid Empire left their marks, building cities so magnificent that European travelers centuries later could hardly believe their eyes. You can almost hear the soft footsteps of artisans chiseling intricate patterns into stone, the laughter of market-goers haggling over silk, and the prayers whispered in countless mosques. The mainstream fact here is clear. Uzbekistan was a heart of the Silk Road, a jewel that glittered under the rule of great empires like Timur's, whose capital, Samarkand, became a showcase of Persian artistry and Central Asian ambition. Yet under this grandeur there were also the less glamorous tales, the labor of countless hands, the taxes that weighed on traders, and the occasional raids that turned prosperity into ashes overnight. You slip into the shade of a caravanserai, those ancient inns where travelers shared tea and rumors. It is easy to picture merchants exchanging not only silk and spices, but also ideas that shaped entire civilizations. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that melons from this region were so prized in medieval times that rulers would send them packed in ice to distant courts just to savor the sweet taste of Central Asia in midwinter. Imagine the logistics mules carrying frozen fruit through scorching deserts just so some royal palate could experience a fleeting pleasure. Over centuries, waves of conquerors swept through the Arabs, bringing Islam, the Mongols leaving their mark in destruction and governance, the Persians influencing art and language. Each wave added layers to the region's identity, and you sense that even in turmoil there was an adaptability, a way of bending without breaking. You notice how the Uzbek identity, though not yet shaped under that name, grew from a mosaic of Turkic tribes, Persian cultural threads, and Islamic faith. It's a blend that remains distinctive to this day, a mix of resilience and hospitality. As night falls and stars prick the sky, you settle near the Registan Square, where the monumental madrasas glow softly under moonlight. The domes seem to guard the stories of centuries, whispering that this land has seen countless rulers come and go, and yet its spirit endures. The irony, of course, is that while Uzbekistan today is often seen through the lens of its Soviet past, its deeper roots stretch back to times when Moscow was just a cluster of wooden huts, and this region was already dazzling the world. You wonder quietly whether these ancient layers made it easier for the Uzbek people to hold on to something of their own, even when future empires would try to erase or rewrite their narrative. You fall asleep under the starlight, knowing that the tale of Uzbekistan's independence begins not in the 20th century, but here in the hum of its ancient markets, the call to prayer echoing off its minarets, and the enduring pride of a land that has always been more than a pawn on someone else's board. You awaken with the first light, spilling over the Fergana Valley where fields shimmer with dew and distant mountains loom like silent guardians. It feels serene, yet you sense the shifting of winds that once carried not just the scent of orchards, but the heavy tread of soldiers. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the world beyond these valleys had grown hungry for new territories, and Russia, like an impatient bear, began to edge southward. The Khanates of Khiva Bukhara and Kokand, independent in name but often locked in rivalries, stood directly in the path of the empire's expansion. You walk through Kokand's bustling bazaar where locals gossip nervously about rumors of Russian forts creeping ever closer, the tension almost as thick as the smell of spices in the air. The Russian Empire's advance into Central Asia was not a sudden storm but a slow, calculated tightening of a net. They built military outposts, struck deals with tribal leaders, and exploited internal divisions among the Khanates. Historians still argue whether the Russian conquest was an inevitable product of its imperial ambitions or a reaction to British influence creeping in from the south during the so-called Great Game. Either way, you picture Russian officers plotting maps in candlelit tents while local rulers struggle to hold on to their independence, sometimes making alliances, sometimes launching desperate attacks. The mainstream fact is clear: by the late 1800s, the once proud Khanates had been subdued, with territories gradually annexed into the Russian Empire. You stroll along the walls of Khiva's Ichan Kala, now a UNESCO-protected wonder, but back then a fortress of resistance. Imagine the fear as Russian artillery battered those walls, the air thick with smoke and defiance. A quirky detail slips through the cracks of history. Russian soldiers, unused to the desert climate, reportedly wore wool uniforms even in the blazing summer, collapsing under heat that locals endured with ease. It's a small irony, conquerors sweating miserably while locals watched from the shade. Under Tsarist rule, Central Asia became both a prize and a laboratory. The Russians imposed administrative reforms, brought railways and introduced new crops, yet they also drained local autonomy, replacing Khanate traditions with imperial bureaucracy. You walk through a newly built Russian-style street in Tashkent around 1900, where European-style buildings rise awkwardly beside mud brick homes. There's a strange blend of cultures: Orthodox churches casting shadows near mosques, Russian soldiers lounging beside Uzbek artisans. The locals adapt as they always have, learning to navigate the new order while quietly holding on to their customs. Despite the changes, the spirit of resistance simmered. You hear stories of uprisings like the Kokand Rebellion of 1873 and the fierce defense of Geoktepe battles, where locals fought against overwhelming odds. Some resisted openly, while others preserved identity in subtler ways, song storytelling the continued use of their language at home. You notice the seeds of future nationalism quietly taking root, though few could yet imagine the far greater upheavals to come. As decades pass, the Russian presence grows more entrenched. They exploit the region's resources, turning vast tracts of land into cotton fields, a foreshadowing of the Soviet policies to come. Yet as you wander through a quiet evening in Bukhara, you realize the empire never fully understood the land it conquered. Local traditions, shaped by centuries of Silk Road exchange, were too deeply woven to be erased by decrees from St. Petersburg. The bazaars still buzz with the same energy, the call to prayer still rises, and the people still pass down stories that remind them who they are. The night deepens, and you sense that Uzbekistan is poised at the edge of a new chapter. The Russian Empire may have placed its flag over these cities, but the heart of the land continues to beat to its own rhythm. It's a rhythm that will soon clash with the drums of revolution rolling down from the north, promising liberation, but delivering a very different kind of chain. The morning light feels different now, almost brittle, as if the air itself senses the tremors of change coming from far to the north. You find yourself wandering through Tashkent in the early 20th century, where the streets hum with rumors of revolution. The Russian Empire is stumbling under the weight of its own contradictions, and whispers of Bolsheviks and workers' councils drift across train stations and tea houses. When the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution erupts, its shockwaves travel quickly along the rails that now crisscross Central Asia, carrying not just goods but radical ideas. You watch as soldiers and workers gather under red banners, their eyes alight with something between hope and fury. For many Uzbeks, the fall of the Tsar initially seems like an opening a chance to reclaim autonomy after decades of imperial control. Yet as you follow a crowd into a square where fiery speeches echo off the walls, you sense the complexity. The Bolsheviks speak of equality and the end of exploitation, but they also eye Central Asia as a resource and strategic frontier. Historians still argue whether the revolution was a true liberation for the region or simply a transfer of power from one empire to another, one crowned the other, draped in red. You pass by the madrasas of Bukhara, where scholars debate nervously whether the new order will tolerate their traditions. Some local leaders, inspired by reformist movements like the Jadids, cautiously hope that the Bolsheviks will support modern education and autonomy. The Jadids, blending Islamic thought with progressive ideas, advocate for schools that teach both science and faith, but their dreams quickly clash with the hard edge of Soviet ideology, which distrusts any authority other than its own. In 1920, you watch Red Army troops march into Bukhara, cannons pointed at ancient walls as the emirate collapses in flames. The smell of smoke mixes with the scent of centuries-old books burning, and the old world seems to crumble into ashes. A mainstream fact stands tall here. By the early 1920s, Soviet forces had defeated local resistance and established control over the territories that would soon form the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. Yet resistance did not vanish overnight. You hear the distant crackle of gunfire in the mountains, where the Basmachi movement bands of guerrilla fighters refuse to bow to Moscow's authority. They fight a brutal, often romanticized war, hiding in deserts and valleys, striking and vanishing like ghosts. Their struggle is fierce, but the Soviet state, relentless in its campaigns, eventually crushes them. The debate lingers: were the Basmachi heroes of independence or fragmented groups fighting a hopeless cause? Perhaps as you walk under the shadow of their legends, you sense they were both. Life in the 1920s feels caught between destruction and rebuilding. You stroll through streets where Russian soldiers patrol alongside local traders, where revolutionary slogans are painted over traditional markets. Quirky scenes appear amid the turmoil: a Bolshevik commissar awkwardly trying to ride a camel during a propaganda tour, or revolutionary theatre performances staged in villages where locals stare more at the costumes than the ideology. Yet beneath the surface, the Soviet grip tightens. Land reforms redistribute property but also uproot centuries-old ways of farming. Mosques are closed or repurposed, Islamic courts abolished, and local elites are sidelined, exiled, or worse. By the late 1920s, Uzbekistan is firmly bound into the Soviet orbit, no longer an autonomous land, but a piece of a larger centralized machine. You see new schools teaching Russian and Marxism factories rising where fields once stretched, and red flags fluttering from rooftops. The old Khanates and emirates are gone, replaced by Soviet councils and 5-year plans. Yet in the faces of the people you pass, you detect a quiet endurance. They adapt, as they always have, surviving storms that would flatten others. As dusk settles over the Fergana Valley, you stand on a hill and watch the lights of a Soviet train snaking through the darkness. It's a reminder that the revolution has not just redrawn borders, it has rewritten the very rhythm of life here. The chains are new, forged in ideology rather than crowns, and though they glitter with promises of equality, they tighten all the same. You awake to the rumble of machinery and the sharp scent of coal drifting across a landscape that looks nothing like the Silk Road of old. The 1930s have arrived, and Uzbekistan is no longer a patchwork of Khanates or contested empires. It is a fully integrated Soviet republic, its destiny scripted in Moscow's offices far to the north. You step into a street in Tashkent where Russian signs hang alongside Uzbek words written in a new Latin script, soon to be changed again to Cyrillic as part of a relentless policy of assimilation. Factories spew smoke into the sky, their chimneys rising like exclamation marks over a society being reshaped at breakneck speed. Under Stalin's rule, Uzbekistan experiences a whirlwind of forced transformation. The old feudal structures are dismantled, mosques closed, and local leaders, those who might dare to challenge Moscow's authority, are branded as counter-revolutionaries. You walk past a school where children recite verses of Lenin rather than Quranic prayers, their textbooks filled with the promise of a bright, socialist future. Historians still argue whether this rapid modernization was a necessary leap into the modern world or a cultural assault that erased much of the region's soul. Either way, the mainstream fact stands by the 1930s. The Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic was firmly under Stalin's control, its industries growing, but its autonomy suffocated. Collectivization sweeps across the countryside, and you wander into a village where farmers, their faces lined with worry, gather around a Soviet official reading orders to hand over their land and livestock to the new collective farms. Resistance is met with brutal crackdowns, and whispers of famine travel like cold wind through the valley. In the fields, workers toil not for themselves but for the quotas set by distant planners. Yet amid the hardship, the cotton industry begins to expand dramatically, a foreshadowing of its future role as the white gold that Moscow covets. Walking deeper into the countryside, you notice the eerie silence of abandoned religious schools and shrines, victims of Stalin's purges against religion. Imams vanish in the night, intellectuals are exiled to Siberia, and families hide their faith behind closed doors. The quirky tidbit you overhear in a hushed conversation is that some villagers disguised their sacred Qurans by sewing them into the linings of pillows, faith literally becoming something to sleep on to keep it safe. Even in oppression, creativity survives. The 1930s also bring the infamous purges, and you find yourself in a dimly lit courtroom where accusations fly with no evidence, where local leaders who once cooperated with the Soviets are now accused of treason. Their fates are sealed before the trials even begin. Fear creeps through every household, and neighbors avoid eye contact, knowing that one careless word can lead to a knock on the door at midnight. Despite the terror, Soviet modernization projects continue to reshape life. Roads, schools, and hospitals emerge, and literacy rates climb dramatically. You step into a classroom buzzing with children who, for the first time in generations, can all read and write. This progress is real, and yet it comes wrapped in propaganda, teaching loyalty to the state above all else. The Uzbek identity bends under the weight of these changes, but it does not break. Language, music, and traditions find small ways to survive. Weddings still pulse with ancient rhythms, and poetry continues to whisper truths that slogans cannot drown out. World War II brings another twist. You watch trains arriving in Tashkent carrying evacuees from the Western Soviet Union as Nazi armies advance. The city becomes a refuge, its people sharing food and shelter with strangers. Factories ramp up production for the war effort, and Uzbek soldiers march off to distant battlefields, many never to return. It's during these years that a sense of shared sacrifice begins to grow, binding Uzbeks more tightly to the Soviet Union, even as they quietly yearn for something of their own. By the late 1940s, as you stand in a Tashkent rebuilt from wartime strain, you realize that the Soviet Republic has been forged, industrialized, Sovietized, and tightly bound to Moscow's will. The price has been high: cultural loss, political repression, and environmental changes that no one yet fully understands. The chains have changed shape, but they are chains nonetheless, shining in the glow of progress while cutting deep into the roots of a proud people. As night falls over the city, the red star atop the local government building glows faintly against the dark sky, a symbol of power that feels both distant and suffocating. You sense that beneath the surface, something still stirs, something ancient and unbroken, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Morning mist curls over vast fields of cotton, their white tufts glowing faintly like snow under the rising sun. You wander through rows that seem to stretch endlessly, and it strikes you how this crop, so harmless looking, has become both the lifeblood and the curse of Uzbekistan under Soviet rule. Moscow demands cotton mountains of it, and every hectare of arable land is bent to its will. Farmers bend too, their hands raw from endless picking as officials in distant offices tally quotas and boast about meeting plans. This is the era where white gold becomes king, but the throne it sits on is built from exhausted soil-drained rivers and the sweat of countless laborers. The Soviet obsession with cotton transforms not just agriculture but entire landscapes. You trace the path of irrigation canals slicing through the desert, diverting the waters of the Amudarya and Sirdarya rivers to feed the fields. The quirky tidbit here is almost absurd. Moscow sent engineers to calculate exactly how much water would be needed, but ignored warnings from local experts about environmental risks. They laughed off such concerns, confident in their science. You walk farther and see the result, lush cotton fields thriving for now, but the Aral Sea, once the world's fourth largest lake, begins its slow, tragic retreat. Fishermen stand by shrinking shores, boats stranded on dry sand, their livelihoods evaporating with the water. Historians still argue whether this environmental disaster was sheer negligence or a calculated sacrifice for Soviet industrial goals. As you step into a collective farm during harvest season, the air buzzes with the chatter of workers, many of them women and children pressed into service. Officials in pressed uniforms supervise clipboards in hand, ensuring that quotas are met. Cotton is not just an agricultural product here, it is a political symbol. Meeting the plan means loyalty to the state, falling short invites punishment. At times, local leaders falsify figures to avoid Moscow's wrath, building a culture where deception quietly props up the system. You can almost hear the nervous laughter of a farm manager handing in inflated numbers, hoping no one checks too closely. The cotton economy enriches the Soviet center, but leaves little for the locals. Farmers receive meager pay and traditional crops are sidelined, leading to food shortages in a region once known for its abundance. In cities, the cotton trade fuels corruption with bribes and backroom deals, flourishing under the shadow of Moscow's demands. Yet even here, amid the rigid structures, people find ways to survive and resist, planting hidden gardens, trading quietly in bazaars, and weaving their own threads of resilience. Walking through Tashkent during the 1960s, you notice another layer of change. The city, rebuilt after a devastating earthquake in 1966, now boasts wide boulevards, Soviet monuments, and concrete apartment blocks. Factories hum, schools thrive, and cinemas show films glorifying the socialist dream. Life on the surface appears modern and stable, but you catch glimpses of what lies beneath traditional weddings, celebrated in secret, elders whispering old stories and young poets slipping nationalist undertones into their verses. The national spirit refuses to be fully erased, simmering quietly while the state tries to mold it into something uniform. The cotton campaign continues to expand into the 1970s, its grip tightening. You walk through a meeting room where officials from Moscow praise Uzbekistan as the Soviet Union's reliable supplier, oblivious or indifferent to the environmental and social costs mounting beneath their statistics. The shrinking Aral Sea becomes a silent witness to this era, its receding waters exposing not only dead fish, but the hollow promises of progress. People joke darkly that soon they will walk to the lake's center to have a picnic where waves once rolled. The humor is bitter, but it keeps them going. By the late 1970s, cracks begin to show in the facade. Reports emerge of massive corruption involving cotton quotas, with officials siphoning off funds and fabricating harvest numbers on an astonishing scale. The so-called cotton scandal brews quietly, and you sense the unease among bureaucrats as Moscow begins to investigate. Yet the scandal also exposes a deeper truth. The Soviet system in Uzbekistan is a house of cards, impressive to look at, but fragile underneath. As the sun sets over a field where workers still pick under fading light, you feel the weight of decades pressing on this land. Cotton has brought infrastructure, industry, and attention from the Soviet center, but it has also left scars, environmental wounds, economic distortions, and a dependency that chains Uzbekistan's fate to Moscow's policies. You stand in the quiet, the distant hum of irrigation pumps echoing like a heartbeat, and you know that beneath these fields, something is stirring. The land remembers what it was before the Soviet plow, and its people carry a memory too, a quiet insistence that someday these chains will rust. The night air over Tashkent smells faintly of smoke and spices as you weave through narrow alleys where old melodies drift from hidden courtyards. It is the 1980s now, and you sense a curious tension on the surface. Soviet life continues with its usual rhythms, but beneath it the national spirit pulses like a heartbeat too strong to ignore. You pass by walls where faded propaganda posters peel, revealing older layers of paint beneath, as if the city itself remembers what it once was. The Uzbek identity, long pressed under Soviet molds, begins to show itself more openly through art poetry and whispered conversations. In this decade, young musicians strum traditional instruments in private gatherings, blending ancient rhythms with modern sounds. Poets write verses that speak of desert's ancestors and freedom, cloaking their words just enough to pass the censors. Even in state-run theatres, subtle hints of Uzbek pride slip through like sunlight through cracks. Historians still argue whether this cultural revival was a deliberate quiet resistance or simply a natural resurgence of identity after decades of suppression. Perhaps it was both born from a need to remember. You walk through a university courtyard where students dressed in Soviet uniforms debate politics in low voices. Glasnost and perestroika, the reforms introduced by Gorbachev, have begun to loosen the iron grip of censorship, allowing ideas once banned to circulate. The debates are hesitant at first, but soon the air hums with questions. What does it mean to be Uzbek? How much longer will Moscow dictate their lives? You watch a young woman argue passionately with her peers, her voice trembling not with fear, but with excitement. The idea of autonomy is no longer unthinkable. Meanwhile, in rural villages, the weight of Soviet policies still presses heavily. You stand by a canal where water trickles weakly, a shadow of its former flow. The environmental disaster of the Aral Sea grows worse by the day, its once bustling ports now stranded in deserts of salt. The quirky tidbit here is as bitter as it is ironic. Locals begin using the dried seabed for makeshift car races, driving where ships once sailed. The laughter of drivers echoes across emptiness, mocking the failure of Moscow's grand irrigation schemes. The cotton scandal breaks open during this period, and you find yourself in a smoky government office where investigators sift through piles of falsified reports. The scandal, involving billions of rubles in corruption, shakes the Soviet image of Uzbekistan as a model republic. High-ranking officials are arrested, but many believe the trials are more about saving Moscow's reputation than addressing local grievances. For ordinary Uzbeks, the scandal is both a source of dark humor and a grim reminder of how deeply corruption has entwined with daily life. Despite all this, daily routines persist. In bazaars, traders sell melons and spices under watchful eyes, bargaining with quiet smiles that hint at a resilience unbroken by decades of control. Families gather for weddings where ancient songs rise louder than any Soviet anthem, and grandmothers tell stories of heroes who fought against conquerors long before the Soviets arrived. The national spirit thrives not in grand declarations, but in these small, stubborn acts of remembering. By the late 1980s, demonstrations begin to stir. You stand in a square where people gather not just to celebrate, but to demand answers from Moscow, from their leaders, from history itself. The slogans are careful at first, couched in calls for reform rather than outright independence, but the energy is undeniable. Students march, workers murmur, and intellectuals publish bold essays in newly tolerant newspapers. You sense that the chains, though still strong, are loosening with every step taken in defiance. At night, you sit under a starlit sky in the Fergana Valley, listening to the quiet. The land seems to hold its breath, aware that something monumental is on the horizon. The Soviet Union, once unshakable, now trembles with cracks in its foundation. And here in Uzbekistan, the people, long silent, long patient, feel the stirring of a future where they might finally stand on their own. The morning air is sharper now, carrying a hint of urgency as you wander through Tashkent in the final years of the 1980s. Posters of Gorbachev's reforms flutter in the breeze, promising openness and restructuring. But the streets tell a different story. Whispers of dissent have grown louder, and eyes that once looked down now meet each other with cautious determination. You pass a cafe where students gather their voices low, but their words bold, discussing perestroika not as a gift from Moscow, but as an opportunity to shape something uniquely Uzbek. Glasnost cracks open the doors of expression, and with it pours decades of suppressed grievances. Newspapers publish daring critiques of corruption, environmental ruin, and the decades-long exploitation of cotton fields. You see a crowd around a newly printed article exposing the catastrophic state of the Aral Sea, with photos of stranded ships sitting like skeletons on cracked earth. People shake their heads in disbelief, some with anger, others with quiet despair. Historians still argue whether it was these environmental tragedies, the economic stagnation, or the cultural awakening that most fueled the growing independence movements, but you can feel that they all played their part, intertwining like the threads of an old rug. In the countryside, workers gather under shade trees to discuss rumors that Moscow may no longer have the power to enforce its will, as it once did. The cotton quotas continue, but more and more farmers grumble openly, their voices no longer drowned out by fear. The quirky tidbit you overhear from an old farmer with a sly smile is that some collectives started planting food crops in secret instead of cotton, hiding the fields behind tall reeds, rebellion disguised as pragmatism. The late 1980s also bring unrest in the Fergana Valley, where tensions between ethnic communities erupt into violence. You walk through streets where fear hangs heavy, shops shuttered, and families flee to safer neighborhoods. The Soviet response is clumsy, sending in troops but failing to address the root causes of the unrest. For many Uzbeks, these events reveal how little Moscow understands their land and how far the Soviet Union has drifted from being a unifying force. Meanwhile, nationalist movements begin to form cautiously at first, then more openly. You attend a gathering in a cultural hall where poets and musicians perform pieces laced with patriotic undertones, the crowd clapping, not just for the art, but for the message hidden within. Political groups emerge, some calling for greater autonomy, others daring to speak the word independence out loud. The air crackles with energy like a storm building on the horizon. Gorbachev's policies, meant to save the Soviet Union, instead expose its fragility. You watch as local leaders, once unquestioningly loyal to Moscow, begin to position themselves for a future where they may need to stand alone. Islam Karimov, rising through the ranks, presents himself as both a loyal Soviet official and a cautious nationalist, navigating the shifting tides with calculated moves. You can almost see him watching the crowds, measuring every word he says, aware that the ground beneath him is changing. Even the Soviet military presence feels less intimidating now. Soldiers patrol the streets, but their expressions lack the confidence of earlier decades. Some even chat casually with locals, sharing cigarettes and stories, as if they too sense the empire's grip weakening. The walls that once echoed with propaganda slogans now bear graffiti calling for reform, for rights, for something more than what the USSR has to offer. By 1990, the Supreme Soviet of the Uzbek SSR declares its sovereignty within the Soviet Union, a legal step that feels like a quiet but undeniable shout. You walk past government buildings where the Uzbek flag flutters alongside the Soviet one, the two symbols sharing a pole but pulling in different directions. People in the streets talk of a future that just months earlier seemed unthinkable. As you sit by the banks of a river under the stars, you feel the land's pulse growing stronger. Decades of repression, environmental wounds, and cultural erosion have not killed the Uzbek spirit, they have tempered it like steel in a furnace. The Soviet Union is cracking, and with every fracture, Uzbekistan's voice grows louder. The stage is set, the air thick with anticipation, and you know the next gust of history's wind will carry the people toward a destiny they have long been denied. The dawn breaks over a restless Tashkent in August 1991, and you can almost feel the tension in the air like a taut string ready to snap. Crowds gather near government buildings, their faces filled with uncertainty, their conversations laced with rumors a coup has erupted in Moscow. tanks roll through the streets of the Soviet capital, hardliners trying to claw back the crumbling power of the Union. You stand among the people here, far from the Kremlin, but close enough to sense the tremors it sends across every Soviet republic. The August coup is brief but dramatic, and its failure signals more than just the end of an attempted power grab. It marks the beginning of the end for the entire Soviet Union. In Uzbekistan, leaders watch events in Moscow with cautious calculation. Islam Karimov, now the head of the Uzbek SSR, senses the opportunity hidden in the chaos. Historians still argue whether Karimov's actions during this period were driven by genuine national interest or a bid to consolidate his own power. But the fact remains, the coup's collapse opens a door that cannot be closed. In the days that follow, protests and rallies intensify. You walk through a square where banners once praising the Soviet state now hang beside hastily made signs calling for freedom. Students chant slogans, workers demand control of their own resources, and elders whisper that perhaps the time they have waited for all their lives is finally here. Even the soldiers stationed nearby stand awkwardly, unsure whether to enforce order or simply watch as history unfolds before them. The quirky tidbit you overhear in a small cafe comes from an old man stirring his tea. He chuckles that the Soviet Union, which once terrified the world, is falling apart not with a bang, but with confusion, paperwork, and half-hearted orders no one obeys. His laughter is tired, but it carries the weight of someone who has lived through every twist of this century-long drama. Karimov moves swiftly, declaring Uzbekistan's independence on August 31st, 1991, just days after the coup collapses. You stand in the crowd as the new national flag, sky blue with a white crescent and stars, rises for the first time, fluttering nervously in the breeze as if testing its own strength. The cheers that follow are not just loud, they are raw, a release of decades of restrained hope. For the first time in generations, Uzbeks can look to a future not dictated by a distant capital. Yet the mood is not purely celebratory. Alongside the joy, there is a quiet unease. Independence is thrilling, yes, but it is also terrifying. The Soviet Union provided structure industry and a vast economic network. Without it, Uzbekistan must build from the ground up. You hear hushed conversations in the market where traders wonder how they will adapt to new currencies and rules. Workers worry whether their jobs will survive the transition, and families fear shortages as old supply chains crumble. The excitement is real, but so is the uncertainty. As the year draws to a close, the Soviet Union itself dissolves entirely, vanishing like a shadow at sunrise. Uzbekistan joins the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loose grouping of former Soviet republics trying to navigate the post-Soviet world together. But even within this association, you sense a strong desire to assert a distinct identity. Karimov delivers speeches about sovereignty and self-reliance, painting himself as the architect of this new chapter. His firm grip on power begins to show, shaping the contours of the nation's early years of independence. Walking through Samarkand now, you see celebrations mixed with solemnity. Families hang the new flag from their balconies while children run through the streets shouting Ozodlik, freedom. In the courtyards, elders recite prayers of gratitude and hope, their voices trembling. You sit with them sipping tea and realize how profound this moment is. After centuries of conquest, colonization, and control by outsiders, the Uzbek people stand under their own sky. Night falls and fireworks burst above Tashkent, reflected in the windows of concrete apartment blocks built in Soviet times. The architecture remains, the scars of history remain, but something has undeniably shifted. The chains have fallen, and though the road ahead is uncertain, it is theirs to walk. You gaze at the stars, those same stars now shining on the new flag, and feel the weight of the moment settle gently around you. The first dawn of independence feels both familiar and strange, as if the streets of Tashkent have woken to the same sounds of traffic and chatter, but under a sky that suddenly seems wider. You walk past a government building where the new Uzbek flag flutters boldly its crescent and stars catching the morning light, and the Soviet emblem has been taken down. Yet, as you watch the bustle of workers and officials, You sense that not everything changes overnight. Old habits cling stubbornly, like dust on stone. The early 1990s are a turbulent time. Independence brings pride, but also daunting challenges. The Soviet safety net is gone, replaced by uncertainty in every sector. You step into a marketplace where traders haggle in the new national currency, still unfamiliar in people's hands. Shelves that once relied on goods from across the USSR now stand half empty, and prices climb higher each week. Historians still argue whether the hardships that followed were an inevitable price of sovereignty or the result of policies that failed to cushion the transition. Either way, you see how ordinary families shoulder the burden, stretching every coin, planting small gardens to feed themselves and clinging to their traditions as anchors. Islam Karimov consolidates power quickly, presenting himself as the leader who will guide Uzbekistan through these storms. You attend one of his early speeches in a packed square, the crowd listening with a mix of hope and caution. Karimov speaks of unity, stability, and the revival of Uzbek culture, promising to preserve the nation's identity while modernizing its economy. His words soothe, but you also notice the careful way security forces watch the crowd, a subtle reminder that dissent is not welcome. Cultural revival sweeps across the country, and you see how people embrace symbols long suppressed under Soviet rule. Mosques reopen, traditional festivals return, and Uzbek becomes the official language, replacing Russian in schools and government. The quirky tidbit here: in some villages, locals celebrate independence by holding massive plov feasts, cooking in enormous cauldrons that could feed an army, as if to say, "We survived and we will thrive." Music, poetry, and art flourish, drawing on centuries of heritage to craft a new national identity that feels both ancient and fresh. Yet independence is not only about culture, it is also about survival in a rapidly changing world. You walk through newly opened offices where foreign investors meet local officials, the air thick with the smell of coffee and cautious optimism. Uzbekistan opens its doors to global markets, striking deals with Turkey, South Korea, and Western countries while carefully maintaining ties with Russia. There is a sense of walking a tightrope, balancing tradition with globalization, sovereignty with economic necessity. In the countryside, farmers slowly regain control over their land, but the cotton fields remain still central to the economy. The environmental wounds of the Aral Sea deepen, and you visit a once thriving port now stranded miles from water. Children play soccer on the dusty seabed where ships rust like forgotten relics. Scientists come from around the world to study the disaster, shaking their heads, while locals simply shrug. They have been living with this loss for years. The political climate hardens as Karimov cracks down on opposition, portraying himself as the guardian of stability in a region rife with uncertainty. You hear stories of journalists silenced and activists jailed, and you feel the tension between the dream of freedom and the reality of authoritarian control. Historians still debate whether Karimov's firm rule saved Uzbekistan from chaos or stifled its democratic potential, but as you watch him on television, his face framed by the new flag, it is clear he has become the face of the nation's rebirth. Despite these contradictions, the spirit of independence thrives. Schools teach a new curriculum that celebrates Uzbek heroes of the past, and children learn to take pride in their history. In markets, old Soviet slogans fade while traditional crafts re-emerge, vibrant with color and confidence. You walk through Samarkand at sunset, where the Registan glows under golden light, and you hear a young guide explaining to tourists not just the history of the monuments, but the story of a people who endured and reclaimed their voice. There, as night settles, families gather on balconies drinking tea under the stars, their conversations filled with cautious hope. The journey is far from over. Uzbekistan is still finding its footing, still learning what it means to be fully free. But as you look around, you realize that the country is no longer simply surviving, it is beginning to imagine its future. The Soviet chains have been shaken off, and in their place the people are weaving something new, something their own. The early years of independence slowly fade into the late 1990s, and as you walk through Tashkent, the city feels both familiar and transformed. The Soviet monuments still stand, some gathering dust, others repurposed, while new buildings rise with distinctly Uzbek flourishes, arches, mosaics and colors that speak of a revived heritage. The air carries a mixture of uncertainty and cautious pride. The nation is still young, still learning to balance the weight of its past with the possibilities of its future. Islam Karimov, now firmly entrenched as president, shapes the country's path with a steady hand. He builds a narrative of strong centralized leadership, arguing that stability must come before democracy. You attend a rally where banners proclaim unity and progress the crowd waving flags with crescents and stars that gleam in the sunlight. Yet behind the staged optimism, you overhear hushed conversations about political prisoners, restricted freedoms, and the risks faced by those who dare to question authority. Historians still debate whether Karimov's leadership secured the nation during a volatile time or held back the growth of a freer society. Either way, you sense the duality, strength and control walking side by side. Economically, Uzbekistan trudges forward with determination. Cotton remains king, but new industries sprout: gold mining, energy exports and slowly expanding tourism. You stroll through markets where traders now sell not only local goods, but imported electronics and clothing, signs of a country opening cautiously to the wider world. Foreign companies establish a presence and foreign aid projects bring new roads, schools and hospitals. The quirky tidbit you overhear from a taxi driver: he jokes that his car, an old Soviet Lada, now has a Korean engine, just like the country, he says, still running, but rebuilt with new parts. In villages, life remains tough. You watch farmers toil in fields under the same sun as their ancestors, their hands rough, but their pride intact. Children help in the fields after school, their laughter carrying over the rows of cotton. The Aral Sea disaster worsens, leaving behind ghost towns and rising health problems from the toxic dust that blows across the region. International cameras capture the tragedy, but for locals it's just part of daily life. Despite the hardship, there is resilience. You see it in the small vegetable gardens hidden behind fences, in the community gatherings where people dance to old songs, and in the quiet determination etched on every face. Culture flourishes in new ways. Traditional crafts, ceramics, silk weaving and embroidery reclaim a place in both homes and global markets. Musicians revive ancient melodies, blending them with modern styles, while filmmakers tell stories once censored. Schools teach Uzbek history with pride, and in classrooms, maps no longer place Moscow at the center. You visit a university where students speaking in Uzbek and English discuss not just their country's challenges, but its potential. Their optimism is contagious, and you can't help but believe that the nation's brightest days still lie ahead. Politically, the tight grip on power continues, yet the identity of the nation solidifies. Uzbekistan joins international organizations, sends athletes to global competitions, and welcomes tourists eager to see the legendary Silk Road cities. The image of Samarkand and Bukhara shines on postcards and TV screens, symbols of both history and ambition. You stand in Registan Square during a festival, lanterns glowing and music echoing against ancient walls, and you feel the past and present intertwining seamlessly. By the early 2000s, Uzbekistan stands as a nation carved from centuries of struggle, tempered by Soviet control, and forged anew in independence. The road ahead is not without obstacles. Corruption, human rights concerns, and economic challenges remain, but there is no mistaking the sense of ownership that now fills the air. The people may debate the pace of reform, they may criticize or defend their leaders, but they do so under their own flag, in their own voice. As dusk descends on the desert and stars emerge one by one, you sit quietly on a rooftop sipping tea. The city hums below, its lights flickering like fireflies. You think of the centuries this land has endured: conquerors, empires, revolutions and chains. And yet here it is, standing tall, breathing freely. The wind carries the call to prayer from a distant minaret, mingling with the honk of a car and the laughter of children playing in the street. It's a soundscape uniquely Uzbek, ancient and modern, fragile and strong. You let the moment settle in the night, wrapping around you like a blanket. The story of Uzbekistan's independence is not just one of breaking free, It is a story of remembering who you are, of carrying the weight of history without being crushed by it. The chains have fallen, and in their place a new dawn stretches endlessly across the steppe. The journey is not finished, it never truly is, but for now, the stars above seem to whisper that the nation is finally its own. And so, with the city's lights fading softly into the horizon, the story comes to rest, leaving you with a quiet assurance that freedom once claimed has a way of enduring. The night softens further, and with it the tone of the tale. You slow your breathing, letting each image of Uzbekistan, its golden domes, its deserts, its bustling bazaars, settle like sand in a calm hourglass. The years of conquest and control drift away like distant echoes, leaving only the steady pulse of a people who endured and reclaimed their voice. You picture the Aral winds quieting the cotton fields, resting under moonlight, the flag's crescent glimmering gently in the breeze. The chains that once bound this land have rusted and fallen, and in their place something new and tender grows, fragile but resilient. You imagine yourself walking through a silent Samarkand square at midnight, the stars overhead reflecting in the glazed tiles of ancient walls. The city sleeps, the country dreams, and you too feel a drowsy peace settle over you. The story lingers like a lullaby, reminding you that even after centuries of shadows, the dawn always comes, and it always feels brighter when it belongs to you. So close your eyes now, knowing the journey is safe, the night is calm, and the winds of history have carried you to a resting place where freedom hums softly in the air. Sleep knowing that somewhere far away under the same sky, Uzbekistan's heart beats steadily in its own rhythm, free, proud, and unbroken. And